When the underserved,
Yes. Yeah.
still takes me back to the women,
Yeah.
the youth, which is mostly the
Yeah.
girls, young women and girls,
Yeah.
as well as people with disability.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Lives. Oh, that's my voice.
Can everyone hear me clearly? Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure we're all nice and refreshed and full as well after a very varied lunch with a lot of variety. It's an honor for me to be in the presence of, such great and powerful women and men. I like to make an inside joke and say women with power in a South Africa without power. ESCOM. um, it's been a pleasure to hear from other moderators with, the Minister of Menopause, who has recently, assumed her new role, Minister of Menstruation, and our other esteemed panelists and moderators. As for me, if I were to summarize and describe myself, I would simply say that I am a numbers lady. I could literally do numbers and calculations in my sleep. You could wake me up in the middle of the night and ask me to solve an equation or tell you which cell to put an equation in Excel, and I would be able to do that. And this is attributed partly to my father, who is like one of our panelists, a chartered accountant by profession. But I also don't want to underplay or, overlook the role played by my grade 7 teacher, who made sure that my class, especially the women in my class or the females in my class, were empowered with numbers. She always used to focus on us more than she did on the guys, because she felt that there was a need to bridge the gap. So she would always encourage us and say, if you need help, just stay behind, and I'll assist you with that. And in the morning session, we spoke about technology and all of that and how it empowers women. But I'd like us to take a step back and just look at where it starts, because we might overlook the exclusion criteria that mathematics has, for not just women or girls, but for boys as well. When you are studying and you don't have mathematics for your matric, or if you don't have a good pass in mathematics for matric, and that's pure maths, there's certain programs that you won't be able to enter in varsity. So just to speak to, one of the points raised by one of the participants who said, aren't we overemphasizing it? I don't think it's being overemphasized in my view. I think that it's something that should be encouraged, just so that people don't look at numbers or technology as something that's difficult. But if you master it from a very young age and you know that numbers is just presenting a problem, and a problem that has a solution, then that could change the narrative and change the mindset for not only the girl child, but for students across the board. With my research background, I had the privilege of reading The Africa in Fact on the flight back to Joburg yesterday. And because I like numbers, I started looking at different articles and the numbers in the articles, and I'm just like trying to see the correlation between, the different author statistics. One author had early child marriages and, adolescent, pregnancies. And I was just like, well, there's a correlation here. If you look at the numbers, the rising, regions with the highest numbers in early child marriages, there's also a proportionately high number in adolescent pregnancies in that same region. And I also had the privilege of looking at the out of school rate for adolescent girls. And I found a correlation with the completion rate, the low completion rate in the same age group for adolescent girls. So it's easy to see a correlation, But as the director of research, who is my boss at Good Governance Africa, always says, he says that correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. So it would be interesting for myself and my team, which is the analytics team, is Governance Insights and Analytics at Good Governance Africa, after this convening, to look at the causation and see that what is causing that correlation, or what are the variables that influence the girls being out of school and the completion rates. So as a person, while I love numbers, quantitative methodologies, I'm more of a qualitative person. So normally when I speak to politicians, and the deputy minister had left us, if I have to present to them, they always ask, your presentation is so short. Why 10, 15 minutes? Are you sure you don't need more time? And I always laugh with them and joke and say, the difference between you and I is I'm an intellectual, I'm not a politician, so I talk less. um, just wanted to share that joke with the deputy minister, and just recognize her and appreciate her in absentia for attending the sessions with us. And naturally, as an individual, I'm a very solutions driven person, if you know me personally. And also as a researcher, you don't stop at the problem statement with research. Problem statement is just identifying the problem, but doesn't end there. There needs to be a literature review, there needs to be a research methodology, there needs to be some analysis that's done, whether qualitative or quantitative. But at the end of all of that, it comes to providing meaningful and practical solutions and recommendations to the research problem that you've identified, which is why I'm very honored to be moderating this panel that is looking at solutions, collaborations, and meaningful ways of finding a way forward to all the problems that we have identified in the AIF issue, as well as throughout the day in the sessions. I'm pleased to be moderating a very esteemed panel that is sitting up here. I will just introduce them briefly, but their bios are available in the program. We have in our midst the CEO of FSD Zambia. Her name is Engwase Mwale. She is a girls' rights activist and a development practitioner currently at FSD Zambia. Her experience, oh wow, includes executive director. She's gold. I'd love to be there. And she has been consistent in advocating for the promotion of women's economic empowerment, sexual and reproductive health, and rights of women and girls, building capacities of women for key decision positions, and working to end gender-based violence through spearheading interventions to end child marriages, teen pregnancies, and violence against women and girls. So you can see that the panel is already framed with specialists in solutions. We also have Dr. Linda Nkomo, who is like my dad, a chartered accountant. She is also the CEO of the New Love Life Trust and chairperson of the Old Mutual Foundation Board of Trustees. Like I said, the experience on this panel, is very inspiring for me, and I look forward to, sometime in my career reaching this stage, and I'm greatly inspired and honored to be facilitating this panel. We also have on the panel Ubafana Kumalo, who is also an executive director at Sonke Gender Justice, but he is not only the executive director, he is also the co-founder of Sonke Gender Justice. He has technical advisory experience, and he has also had an active role in, working with the national and provincial governments in planning and coordination of many activities that are related to gender, men, and HIV and AIDS. And finally, last but certainly not the least, We have a senior clinical psychologist at the University of Pretoria, who is also the resident psychologist at Mind and Body Matters, who also happens to be a friend of mine that I met at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, just like Linda and Lebo. So Mashudu, we have some aspiration and goals to look up to. We are in our early 30s, so I'd love to see what we'd have done in 15 to 20 years time, and if we'd be able to stand in a forum similar to this and reflect as Linda and Lebo have done. So Mashudu's experience includes, working with the local and national government, with correctional services, as well as providing psychological support to teenagers, families, as well as public and private hospitals. So this is our panel for today, and I am happy to be a member of this panel. I'm just going to come down and sit with my panel so that we can engage in some meaningful discussions. So we have had a day that has been filled with identifying, possible challenges that the girl child face, a sort of situational analysis and a diagnosis of, the girl child in Africa, particularly with where we find ourselves in this time. And, some of the key issues that have been identified include, the violence against women and girls, the lack of access to free and affordable education, the exclusion that the girl child has from the education system because of, natural causes such as, the menstruation, the preference that is given to, the boy child as opposed to the girl child when it comes to, house chores, where the girl child finds herself missing out on, homework, learning, studying, because she has to do more of house chores as opposed to her male counterparts. And, we have also seen that there are already policies in place. We saw the previous speaker talking about how there is beautiful policies in her country in Kenya. And what I would like to ask the panelists, in opening, is that in your experience, how would you suggest collaborative work with the end goal being solutions that are practical and that can be implemented? Because we have seen that there is paperwork in place, there are policies in place, and we don't exist in a vacuum, whether you're an individual or an organization or a government or a family. We relate every day. So, what possible collaborations would you individually suggest going forward in your different and respective fields of expertise? I'd like to start with you.
Okay. No, thank you so much. What a wonderful, insightful day it has been since morning. And I want to pick up from the issue of the intersectionality and the commonality of issues and experiences of young women and girls worldwide. Because when you really look at what has been discussed since morning, this is a scenario, it is a situation in almost all our African countries. And therefore, it makes this day today, 11th October, in commemorating the International Day of the Girl Child, as a point of reflection, as a point of asking ourselves as the African continent, what is it that we can do that will be able to ameliorate the challenges that many of our young women and girls face? I would want to start off with a little bit of numbers, since our moderator is a numbers person. I was reading something today from my home country, Zambia, where in this day and age, when it comes to violence against women and girls, we still have more than 50%, let me say 54% of our women and girls aged between 15 and 49 still believe that a husband or a male figure is justified to hit or beat a woman, or because they've differed on something. This is more than half. And these are people in rural areas. We are now talking about education. access to education, and we know that including household wealth actually does change the scenario, because then a woman, when they're economically empowered, they can access better health, they can actually stand up and defend their rights. So on that number, for me, I'm coming back here to say, in Zambia, like most of the African countries, most of our population is in the rural areas, number one. Secondly, our population in the African continent, like in many of the African countries, is almost like more than 60% young. And we have a young population. Zambia goes up to 70%. So if we can have the young people still believing that violence is justified, for me, it provides the basis of why we must reflect today and why we must make this as a very important priority when we talk about sustainable development. So having said that, is that with this intersectionality as well as the commonalities, there is really impetus for us to be able to coordinate across sectors, for us to be able to better look at how we can collaborate and build partnership that will deal with these challenges. So the first issue that I would want to share, which is somehow worked in Zambia, is first and foremost, yes, beyond policies and laws, we've gone, get into the practicalities of what is happening within our communities. So to end child marriage, for example, we started at national level where we looked at who are the gatekeepers. The traditional leaders are the custodians of culture and tradition. So we made them an integral part of fighting child marriages. Of course, in the morning we heard that it's not really a marriage, it's simply child abuse, because you can't call it a marriage when a child is underage and they haven't consented to a kind of union. So we also identified the education officials. That is important because we were using education as an avenue to fight child marriages. So one, we brought in the education administrators on board, but also we recognize the health to deal with the sexual reproductive health and rights of young women and girls. So we brought them on board and formed what we were calling community, village communities. And these village committees, we turned them into champions that were going to begin to engage at community level to change the mindset, to change the attitude, to change the behavior towards looking at child marriage as an option for families to seek some help. Because what happens is that when a girl child is married off, there's some income, there's some resources that is paid off to the families. And because that was their only source of income, as a result, this was actually becoming an in thing in our rural areas. So secondly, with the kind of job that we're doing now, we've identified that building an economic base for young women and girls is actually an equalizer in itself. So looking at financial inclusion, and that is what FSD Zambia is working towards, to ensure that we can have financially healthy communities. So we are now organizing and mobilizing different young women and girls within the communities, both in school and also out of school. So the in schools, we went ahead as FSD Zambia to develop a financial education supplementary literature. And we did this recognizing from the experience that because our young women and girls within the school system are not exposed to the financial inclusion, financial education, as a result, they are rendered vulnerable and they are also rendered, like in the kind of unserved population. So we are actually currently piloting the financial education supplementary materials in about 100 schools that will target in a very specific way our young women and girls in the school system. At the same time, we have developed a curriculum of financial education materials for those young women and girls out of school, the ones that we are now mobilizing and organizing, in terms of groups. So these groups are actually doing savings on their own, but also we are linking them to economic empowerment opportunities, because we believe that when we are presenting economic empowerment opportunities to the young women and girls, it can actually reduce their vulnerability, it can reduce their marginalization. So then they are not considered excluded, but they can also be considered for some of the national level economic empowerment opportunities. So that is one of the practical applications that we want to do. But also in doing that, we are not working alone. I think this brings us back to why this panel. We are looking at also getting into the financial market sector, identifying the different financial plans, because we believe that in mobilizing and organizing a large pool or a base, building a critical mass in terms of the different actors and innovating on some of the products and services that can bring meaning to our young women and girls out there is a in thing. So we are working with building or even facilitating associations that will work with different groups. We are also working with partners that are focusing on working with young women and also working with girls. So those partners in the communities are the ones we are bringing together to be able to make sure that we are not reinventing the wheel, but we are creating a kind of space where different associations can come together, innovate and build capacities to be able to ensure that they bring about services that will change the lives of our young women and girls. So that is on the mobilization bit and also organizing. But also, secondly, we try to encourage building trust amongst various, financial players. Because one of the things we noticed was that there was a lot of competition, between the different financial service providers. And as a result, because they were being profit driven, they were not really coming up with products that would be able to make sure that they deliver on the young women and girls. So in our spaces, we were able to convene different competing financial service providers and being able to ideate some products and services that would also ensure that they bring the underserved and the unsaved into the picture. And in that way, we were working to reduce the competition, but also to encourage trust amongst competing, institutions, but also building a kind of innovative environment where the underserved and unsaved, who are really meant to be the ultimate beneficiaries, for them to be able to recognize value. I'll stop at this one for now and then pick up on the next questions.
Thank you
Thank you.
very much, Engwase, for those, sharing those lived and real experiences. It also brings some practicality and shows some lessons learned that we can also implement going forward. Linda, I'd like to ask you that how would you suggest that the different stakeholders work together to break down gender equality and the marginalization of girls?
Good afternoon, everybody. And it's really an honor to be here at part of this panel. And while I've been hearing most people talk about how we're celebrating the girl child, for me, it's a lamentation. Because celebration means we've achieved and there is joy. But when I look at where we are now, and I think of when conversations really about the elimination of all forms of violence started, that would have been around 1995 in Beijing. I mean, I was a young adult then and was so excited of what the change in the world would bring about. And it's really disheartening to read a report like this and you find nothing's really changed for girls and young women. But back to your question about collaboration. I work for an organization called Love Life. And the work that we do is really focused on young people between 10 and 24 years old. Started as an HIV campaign, and it has evolved to be an organization that's focused on the holistic health of young people. And collaboration is very key to the kind of work that we do. We find that we have to collaborate when it comes to resources, because there is finite resources for infinite needs. We have to collaborate when it comes to the delivery method of those resources. And one of the methods that I would like to share for the purposes of this conversation that we have found works is one that has got an ecological approach to the way in which we do work. So while the focus of our work is young people, we recognize that there is no point in working with a young person as an individual when he must go home to a certain environment, go live in a community, and ultimately the policy space. So we try to integrate those. So we will talk to young people, and we are one of those organizations that talk about sex and vaginas and penises, because that's the reality of what they need to know to be empowered. I mean, a couple of years ago, we were going through a report on teenage pregnancy, and there had been a boy and girl that fell pregnant at school. And the way they had been taught was that if you sleep together, you're going to fall pregnant. And so she said, but we didn't sleep. We were standing. So it's the that level, of detail. So because we're trying to be, pretend we've never had sex when we talk to these young people. So our approach is to say, listen, I've had sex before. So there's nothing you can tell me about it. What is important is for you to make informed sexual decisions. But we need to then get the parents in the conversations. So our work tends to be done in peri-urban and rural areas because that's where the most vulnerable young people are to be found. And we get the parents and the young people sitting in the same space and facilitate those difficult conversations. And not only be part of the conversations, but start to craft the solutions that will work for them in that particular environment and try and customize them to that particular environment. Because what we found is that what will work in KZN will not necessarily work in Limpopo, because there's cultural nuances that must be taken into account when we have those conversations. So it's very important that we bring and try to get the entire community to be involved in those conversations. And to stress what has been said already, the role of traditional leadership cannot be overemphasized, because they are kind of the custodians of what would happen in predominantly a rural area. And if you can get that traditional leader to buy into what you're doing, to understand it not as a way of undermining what their culture and their traditions are, but as a way of elevating what should be foundational to the long-term survival of that particular community, then you start to see the results. And then I think another thing that we have found works in trying to get to disseminate the information, because like we've been saying for in some of the conversations, the policies are there, but do the people know that the law says you cannot give away your daughter in marriage before a certain age? And in a lot of times they really don't. So you need to make sure that the methods of getting that law known are such that my grandmother, who lives in the deepest part of a society or a community, gets to know that her 13-year-old grandchild is a child, and there is a law that protects her as a child. And if she's impregnated, she cannot accept a goat that says, we're sorry, we've impregnated your granddaughter, and it goes away. But it's important that she understands that a crime has been committed, and the whole process then kicks in. But the gap that I have found in the collaboration approach is really at implementation level, at government level. So if I can share a story with you, in 2019, I think that was the first time we got a report of a 10-year-old giving birth in South Africa. And it was in Limpopo, in the district of Embe. So I went to the district there, and I sat down with the Department of Education to try and understand what the issues were. And I said to the Department of Education, why is there no police case that's being reported? Because the school system would be the first point of being able to say, Linda hasn't been at school for quite a while. What's going on? And then go home and find a pregnant Linda. That's the first point, at least, where that information would be known. And he said, well, even if we do know that, it's the role of the Department of Health to report to the Department of Justice that there is a pregnant young person. And so that's why when the new policy came out at the end of last year, I was the first person to applaud, to say, no, every single person in the value system or in the chain of looking after a young child should have that responsibility, whether it is a mother. So in this particular case, this little girl who was pregnant, she fell pregnant because her mother had hired a man to look after her cow and didn't have money to pay this man to look after the cows. So she gave him her little girl.
Really?
Yes. Now, the Department of Health is not going to do anything. They will deliver because their role is to deliver and record the age. It's the Department of Social Development and this department that will. And that's where it falls through the cracks. Because the mother is not being held accountable, a pace is not being opened, and everybody is expecting that somebody else is going to do the work. So in terms of collaboration, if there's cracks at an interdepartmental level, we'll continue to get the 2022-2023 stats, and we'll say this is how many children gave birth, but we will never get to a point of being able to say Department of Justice has put through so many men and so many adults that knew about this pregnant child and did nothing to protect them.
Thank you for those remarks, Linda. I see some elements of good governance in her presentation, where she's talking about accountability, that we need to have accountability and some levels of transparency in the entire value chain, be it in the home, in the society, in the education system, in the health system. Everyone needs to own up and be accountable and not shift the blame and say, no, it is your responsibility to report such crimes. I'm also encouraged that we're already seeing some of the issues that were raised earlier being addressed. The previous speaker raised the language usage, and here's Linda's organization not only facilitating and providing education on that, but also creating a room or space for dialogues between parents and young people in that regard, and providing education on sex and reproduction openly, which is excellent. And like I said, this is why this session is here. It's for practical solutions that can be implemented going forward. Bafana, with your experience and in your vast contributions that you have already made in the national and provincial government, what encouragement or suggestions would you give to the different pool of stakeholders for collaborations to end or to try to at least deal with the problems that we are facing?
Thank you very much. Well, let me start by saying, when we talk about transformation, we need to acknowledge that transformation requires all of us. And we may move from different vantage points, but it needs to touch everyone. My organization is called Strong Gender Justice. And when we established in 2006, we recognized, for those who are as old as I am, you will recall that in 2006, when you mentioned the word gender in South Africa, it was almost interpreted as women. And we kept asking ourselves with my colleagues, if we talk about this just as being about women, why are we letting men off the hook around issues of accountability? If you talk about gender-based violence, for instance, who commits this violence against women? Why is it that the women also have the burden of stopping gender-based violence? Because women don't violate themselves or each other. So we then said, look, we need to get men into the room, even as they are kicking and screaming, because we need to deal with this. So that's where the collaboration comes in. But that collaboration, I want to suggest, must be on the basis of principle. Because as men, we have been socialized that in every space where we are in, we must lead naturally because we are born leaders. What nonsense. I mean, no one is born a leader.
Yeah.
Leadership is acquired through experience and it's situational. Yeah. And it's important, therefore, that as we find these alliances, how do we ensure that men don't do what we've always done? That when we get into a space, we immediately assume leadership, even when we don't know what we're talking about. The fact that I've got a penis doesn't mean I'm wiser than somebody who's got a vagina. In fact, the opposite is usually true. The truth of the matter is that our enemy, all of us, is patriarchy. All of us say patriarchy is a problem because men are patriarchal. But well, friends, let me tell you, yes, patriarchy is a problem, but it's also a problem for men.
Yeah.
Patriarchy says to me, I must be strong, even when I'm vulnerable.
Mm.
Yeah.
Patriarchy says I must not cry. And therefore, because I suppress my emotions psychologically, it's like a primer stove. Once more, those who are as old as me will know, the principle of the primer stove is pressure. You need to pump the primer stove, but you need to release the energy strategically so that you use it creatively. Now, we live in a society where as men we're being pumped all the time by patriarchy from various corners. And how do we release? We actually explode. And that explosion is usually against women and children. Now, I wanted to make an example with a story that is in the media now about Masi Amini, a young woman who was killed in Iran simply because, listen to this, she was wearing a hijab, but she was not wearing it according to how the military police think she should have worn it. Just for that, today she is no more. Alliances. What is interesting that is happening now in Iran, we're seeing a lot of young women occupying streets, challenging their formidable military leadership there that has always ruled with an iron fist. But women are daring them, taking out their hijabs, burning them. But this is my point. This struggle is not just carried by women in Iran. There are young men who are joining them in the streets. They are beginning to ask questions. Why is it that women must wear these things? Patriarchy is about harmful practices. My sister has just given us an example of child marriages. All these things are done ostensibly to the benefit of men. But we all know that actually there's very little benefit for men. There's no benefit for marrying a 10-year-old, because that's the future of any nation. And these are the things that I think as we seek to find these alliances on how we find solutions to these challenges, we need to begin to turn things around and say, how do we bring everybody into the room so that we walk the same path and find solutions to these challenges? We have a program in my organization. We were just talking about it incidentally. We both studied in Natal, but I didn't know. A program called Men Care. And the anchor of that program is a program we call Positive Fatherhood. Because we said, look, in the morning, Lebu talked elaborately about the systematic manner in which women's rights are violated. And part of it is care work. The burden of care in our homes, in the public space, is on women, including childcare and everything. Now, I always argue, I'm a pastor in my other life, by the way. So there was one birth where there was just one partner, and that's the Immaculate Conception. All others, it takes two to tango. So if it takes two to tango, it must take two to take care. And these are the challenges that I'm saying we must bring to the fore to us men, to say, if it is nice to have sex, we all enjoy sex, we all love it, and there are products, we must also take responsibility jointly. And so our work is to say to men, be present, be available, take responsibility. Because when we start doing that, what we see from this program is very positive spin-offs. These men that take responsibility for their children from birth, from pregnancy actually, because it's not about women going to antenatal clinic just by themselves. We are saying to the men, be there, because what the information is given to the women, the men also need. Because we are not, as men, we are so poor in what I call emotional intelligence. We are taught other things, but not emotional intelligence. So it's important that we teach our young men so that they take responsibility. These men, research shows us, are less prone to violence. they actually bond and become very strong, loving relationships with their children. And it answers a lot of the challenges that we see in our society. Now, if with such a little intervention of saying to men, just take responsibility for your children, support your partners, makes a difference, why are we not doing it? These are the opportunities, I think, for me, for collaboration, but they need to be done on a principle that is transformative, that is human rights based, that is about women's rights. That is critical.
Some excellent, views there, and I'm quite encouraged. Be present, be available, take responsibility. I'm reminded of something similar that I'm trying to practice in my own household. I'm a mother of two. My daughter is 6 years old, and my son is 4 years old. And sometimes my daughter, feels the need to be responsible for her brother. I remember when they started school, my daughter obviously started earlier because she's older. Then my son went into triple nought, and the teacher said, now we don't allow her to go there because she wants to check on him every 5 minutes. So now we've restricted it to once in the morning and once in the afternoon. But now that he's in school and he's used to it, she doesn't even check on him at all. If not, run away from him at break time. It's like, go play with your friends. But what I try to do in my household is, the last time she asked me and said, Mommy, when are you going to teach me to make sandwiches for myself and my brother? And I said, Nana, I'm not going to teach you alone. I'm going to teach you and your brother to make sandwiches together. So I try to say that you and your brother, you need to take care of each other. You and your brother need to protect each other, just so that she doesn't assume, early motherhood, without me even noticing it. And also, when they play with toys and they make a mess, which they do all the time, when it's cleanup time, they're both going to clean up. When it's time out, if they were naughty together, they're both going to time out together. So I'm encouraged by that, and I will keep trying to practice that in my own household, and hopefully raising a better generation while I'm at it. I'm interested to hear from you, Mashudu, particularly with your experience. You've worked with government, you've worked with the private sector, you've worked with healthcare systems, and you're currently working, directly with the students. And in your own opinion and in your views, with all this experience, how would you encourage these different stakeholders to collaborate, in order to break down, the gender equality and marginalization of the girl child in Africa?
Thank you so much, colleague. I just maybe before I respond to your question, would just want to do a bit of a voluntary exercise. Just want to check in. You can do this voluntarily. You're not forced to do that. To check in who has had like a screening for them for their health. Let's say, for example, getting your iron checked, your HIV status, your eyes checked. By show of hands, who has had that check? Okay, it seems like almost everyone in the room. I just want to check who has had the screening in terms of where it pertains to the mental health, like a mental health check-in, a consultation. Okay, I see there's a significant number of hands versus the initial, when you come to our mental health. I just want to reiterate what the World Health Organization continuously purports, that there is no health without mental health. That is very important to always check in where we are at in terms of our mind, where we're at, where it contains our body, and where's the girl child? Where's the girl child when it pertains to issues that impact on the overall well-being? What about their resilience? What about the way they are viewing their bodies as a result of very unequal environments or contexts that they find themselves in? The reason for that exercise, colleagues, I was just trying to iterate that there is need to ensure that we integrate or have an interdimensional approach that not only one factor will contribute to the other, but an interplay of factors at varied levels of the environment. At an individual level, what are we seeing? What is the research also telling us about where children are at? I think we've iterated that quite significantly. But how then do we contribute in the home environment? What are some of the words that we're using that maybe reinforces social norms that further place the mindset of a child at a space where they have got lots of self-doubts about themselves, where they don't believe in themselves, where they don't believe that specific tasks or specific roles should be shifted to them because of their specific genders. And also looking at the family context, we know if we're looking at South Africa, a lot of research has indicated that families are indeed in crisis. And there has been significant policies, significant programs, such as the family preservation programs, that um, that work at connecting families. But also, what's important is how do we also change the narrative of families when families have also changed in its setup? We have a lot of blended families as compared to what we usually would have of typical nuclear families. How do those families now convey the division of roles? How do we also ensure that we involve the girl child? Involve the girl child in terms of the decisions that are made in the home. Not only the girl child, but the boy child. What are they feeling? If you're seeing a child coming back, their books is not written, or they're writing in a style that doesn't make sense. Do we investigate that more? Do we ever look at in terms of what is happening with my child? What is happening in terms of the academic performance? Why am I seeing a decline? Why am I seeing that they keep to themselves of late? What could this be describing? What could this be also indicating of what is happening with my child? Why is it that I'm also noticing that they have started just maybe bedwetting? And maybe what words are we using to engage the child to understand what could be causing this significant behavioral change at this child's life at this point in time? More than shaming the behavior, but understanding the context in terms of what is happening. If we're seeing that they're changing in terms of how they respond to others or start to be very aggressive, quite agitated, what words are we using in the family context to also understand where's the child at? Be it the boy child, be it the girl child, where are they? In terms of the changes that we're seeing, and also what language do we use that promotes open communication? Are we blaming them that it's your fault? Look at why you came back with a dirty dress. But we never try to understand what could have contributed to that, which maybe may not be in keeping on what we see with the child every day. But how would you also educate families, through different advocacy initiatives and NGOs also partnering, working directly in the community level to say, these families could be indicating a number of factors. The language you're going to be using will really help us open, us understand where's the child, where's also mom at, what is also the demands placed on mom, what are demands that are placed on dad, with sometimes very scarce resources, with sometimes very limited socioeconomic opportunities, but where are they at? Because we know that our mind is one powerful aspect that can contribute quite positively, but we also need to understand what's happening as well in terms of where we're at. But also at a community level, how are we also engaging traditional leaders? I know we've talked about this quite intensively, to change the narrative around the domains and the structuring of roles within a home environment. And also, how are we also encouraging our traditional leaders as a way forward, as a collaborative initiative? I'll also just encourage to have collaborative initiatives with traditional healers to involve girl child figures, women figure who may often not be represented significantly as versus the population in which they exist. So to ensure that the education is not taking away, but it's also embracing. There's so many games that can also be used in terms of traditional indigenous games that still instill certain values, values of respect, values of integrity, values of empathy. But how do we communicate these messages? There's the traditional game of like the stones and the circle. It's talking a lot about working as a team. And you can play that on your own, but it's often you would be able to take turns with others. Also showing the roles that we can also play in the home, using that to teach basic social skills that I can wait for my turn and we can also have a chance. But we also need to not only look at that this is only done by me. There's also the I speak vendor, but I'll just try to find an English word to try and say this, like house. There's always teaching those games for children in the home. but teaching them that all roles in the home can also be divided. That mom is not always going to be, you often will see that moms is always carrying the babies, and then, dad is in the farm, but using those resources that are already available, especially where there is scarce research context, where there may be limited resources in terms of what can be done, but what can be used in the context of home. But also maybe at a policy level, also holding the policymakers accountable. If we look at where HIV is at as a country, we can see the great strides made by, activism, and the role we can play as activists to ensure that we deconstruct certain social narratives that may place other genders at a marginalized position, at a position of less power, and also using such responsibility in terms of, ensuring that government is held accountable, ensuring of the governance and implementation. I think our government in South Africa is very positive policies, but there's a gap. That if our policies are very good, why are we still experiencing the challenges that a girl child is experiencing today? And how do we narrow this, and how do we also take the same action that was maybe needed to be taken? I'm just using HIV as an example. How do we use collective, efforts and action of activism to ensure that the girl child also voice and the boy child is also recognized in terms of also ensuring that the resources at a grassroots level also accommodate for their needs, particularly also those with vulnerabilities. I noted that Deputy Minister spoke a lot about the disabilities, and also educating communities around disabilities. There's still myths, there's still misconception, there's still often a stigma, especially around mental health. There's still a lot of stigma, even on physical disabilities themselves. How do we ensure that we capacitate communities also through, public education on their role in terms of how they can also identify early? We know that if we also reach out early, we can also have better outcomes. Better outcomes in the essence that those with vulnerabilities, how do we ensure we protect them? The law is definitely there to protect them, but they need agents and advocacy, because some may not be having the opportunity of being able to communicate, of being able to verbalize, express what some of the concerns are, where it pertains to where they are at in terms of the specific roles and need. And also at a level of high institute, it's important to partner with business, partner with activist groups, to partner with business, in ensuring that research is continuously done on what are some of the best practices, what has worked very well around issues of the girl child. How can we promote this in other different contexts? One of our colleagues mentioned that what works in one community may not work in the other, but how can we embrace that? But also, how can we also use that to reflect on what more we can do? There has been work done, but what more can we extend to ensure that the girl child does not have to struggle with access to education? The girl child does not have to struggle with access to healthcare facility, especially within very scarce resource context. I'll just end with the colleague in terms of what collaboration we can do.
I need to warn you about Mashudu. Half the time when I'm speaking to her, I can't tell if I'm speaking to my friend or the psychologist. And I think you've already seen with the exercise that she started with, that she shifted from the psychologist to the panelist very quickly. Thank you for those insights, Mashudu. You've summarized very well how we need to take a step back and look into the home environment, being cognizant of behavioral changes, in not only the girl child, but as well as the boy child, as well as our communication, and not shaming the children, but rather trying to assist them and find out what is causing those changes. And you also spoke about policy, which one of our panelists also did highlight the gap at implementation, which brings me to my second question for the panelists. I'm interested to know how would you emphasize the urgency, particularly for governments, African governments, to ensure that these existing policies that we have, the Maputo Protocol, the SDGs and the UN's agenda, do not be merely reduced to shelved paperwork, but are actually implemented and practiced in the societies that we live in. I'll start with you,
Okay.
Enwasi.
Yeah, thank you very much. One of the things that I could start with is that many of these instruments that our government sign, they begin maybe at UN level, then they get to the African Union level. And we know that quite a number of countries have ratified a number of instruments. I mean, giving an example of the Maputo Protocol. I mean, many of our countries in here, including my country, have ratified. But of course, we see the challenge that in many instances, our countries do not report adequately in terms of the practicality of what is happening, especially for those instruments that are signed in the name of women and girls. And I think what our role has been is that utilizing the opportunity when member states are reporting to be able to provide platforms for young women and girls, to attend these spaces and begin to raise the issues from their own lived experiences. And I think we do this recognizing that the common aspects that impact on young women and girls, within our regions, within the continent, are actually the same. So in providing those platforms, we've been able to build capacities of the young women and girls, raise their assertiveness, but for them to recognize their own self-dignity, that they can be able to speak passionately about the things that affect themselves. So that is secondly. But of course, we know that when these discussions are held, either at UN level, the Commission on the Status of Women, our member states, commit themselves, to do certain, to put in certain measures that will address some of the challenges that are impacting on women and girls. But as soon as they get back to their countries, it's business as usual. So one of the things that we have been collaborating on and building partnership is how to be able to raise our governments to account, to be able to bring out the same issues that they commit themselves at these international global platforms and reduce them into actionable, sort of intervention, and call in our governments and heads of states, to account on what they are doing, because sometimes you find that they will be committing to reviewing a certain law or regulation at country level, but immediately that is done, you find that simply ends in the policy document, and no one is ready to advocate and even to make sure that is implemented. So one of the things that is being done is to be able to get back to the communities, because then the movement building must be done at different levels. So for example, in Zambia, there's civil society organizations that are working to mobilize communities to form up what we are calling community budget groups, because we know that the national budget is one of the tools that our governments use to be able to implement some of the commitments that they make at the different regional and international level. So with these community budget groups, we started a process where we get the community members themselves to appear before Parliament, together with the activists, because then we believe that when the communities speak for themselves, they will be able to share exactly what is happening in their communities. And we are realizing that when people are provided that opportunities, especially for the young women and girls to speak for themselves, then it brings in a different dimension. And beyond just at national level, we also take the same experience to the regional level. There's an example of an ending child marriage regional group. And this regional group has set up what we're calling the Young Women and Girls Network in SADC region. And this group also engages at different levels. When the SADC summit, for example, is in place, then we create a platform for the young women and girls from the networks to go and speak around the issues that confront themselves, be it young women and girls leadership, reproductive health and rights, and how our governments can be able to ensure that there is adequate resources allocated to ensure that our young women and girls also, participate in the different empowerment programs. So those are some of the convening spaces, but also mobilizing to ensure that the young women and girls can also be able to speak for themselves. And secondly, one of the issues that the moderator was aspiring to do is how does she get to a level like where we are? I mean, executive director. I did not just become an executive director from nowhere. Somebody somewhere opened the doors for me. Somebody somewhere provided information. Somebody somewhere shared their passion in terms of the issues that they believe in. But also, most importantly, I think the role modeling and also ensuring that all of us, are able to find time to be present and available and take responsibility that we are raising an activist, but also we are looking up to somebody whose role is really to ensure that they take responsibility for who we are and what we become. So the issue of role modeling becomes a very important aspect as an opportunity to be able to ensure that our young women and girls are not just left behind. We know that the Sustainable Development Goals, including the Maputo Protocols, is providing a whole range of rights and ensuring that no harmful practices hinder the emancipation of young women and girls. So it is those opportunities that we utilize to ensure that we hold ourselves and the different stakeholders that must come on board to be able to ensure that we make a difference in the lives of young women and girls in our society.
Thank you for that, Engwase. To sum it up, you spoke about the involvement of young women and girls in these policies or in these convenings, as well as being able to hold African governments to account to transform these policies into actionable interventions. And no one will tell you about accountability better than an accountant herself. So I'm interested to hear from you. And you spoke about, one size doesn't fit all, and the marginalized communities. It might be easy for the dissemination of information and education of the policies in the urban, peri-urban areas, but how do we ensure that these governments are implementing these policies all the way to the rural and the deep rural communities, and that they are not left out of the policies?
So, Christine, one of the things that I forgot to talk about, which your question has reminded me of, is the power of community radios in disseminating information. No matter where you are, no matter how deep a rural area you are going to find a radio. And that becomes a very important medium for disseminating information. Now, earlier on, Tony was talking about how when there's a question you asked and you don't know the answer to it, don't stop at I don't know. Move beyond that and find out what the answer is. And the question that I've been asking myself for the longest of times is how do we get government to move from a point of ticking a box and signing a protocol to actually internalizing and believing in it? Because a lot of times, some of the things that we sign on as governments is to keep up with what the rest of the world is saying we should be doing and not because we believe in it. And so if I look at what has happened around gender-based violence in South Africa specifically, once we had the gender, remember in 2018 or so, we shut down the country. Then there was a 2-day summit. It was focused on gender-based violence, and then money was being committed. Nobody knows where that money is gone, right? So I think I personally believe that was just succumbing to pressure because women were saying, we are not going until President you come out here and we give you our demands. And I think so there's an integrity issue that I think we face with government. An issue that around, do I really believe in what is being said? Do I really believe in the change that's required? Am I committed to making it? And so it requires all of us to be activists, like what Molly said, not just wait for the civil society to be activists. And that activism's got to be starting in our homes. Like you were saying, how I raise my children. It's got to be with the mindset of creating a gender equal home, because that's how we'll get a gender equal society or community and ultimately a gender equal world. So we've got to be looking at things like how we're going to measure progress. What's the baseline that we're starting with at the time of implementation? What did the landscape look like? We're now 3 years into implementation. Has anything changed? If what has driven that change? If nothing has changed, what do we need to be doing differently for us to see the change that we want to see? So there is the activism of all of us, holding government accountable, voting governments out if we do not believe that they've got the integrity to do what is required for us to change, to create gender equal societies. And what Bafana said earlier on is so important, that we need to stop the understanding of gender as being a woman's issue and really translate it to being a human issue. Because when we create, we start changing the narrative and we start changing the language, we might see different results. So one of the things that I'm passionate about is the empowerment of boys. I'm passionate about it because I truly believe that if we can get that right, and I'm not talking about economic empowerment, I'm talking about them being empowered as individuals to get to a point where they can coexist with a chartered accountant and not feel threatened. Then we'll start to be able to see the reductions, not only in gender based violence, but in them killing themselves and killing each other. Then we're going to see a reduction in teenage pregnancies. We're going to see workplaces that create equal opportunities for both men and women. And unless, though, we get to a point of embracing the fact that human beings are all equal and need to be, and we level the playing ground or the environment or create an enabling environment for them in which to exist, we will continue to sign off protocols and declarations, and then we'll get to SDG 2063 and whatever the number will be long after we're gone. Nothing will have changed because of the integrity that's required for something to be implemented with the belief in it.
Thank you for that, Linda. I think she's framed it beautifully, and now we see a shift in, not just implementation and holding governments to account, but also the requirement for measuring the progress. She's introduced us to a phase where we see the need for monitoring and evaluation of that implementation. It's not enough for us to just call on our governments to implement at a practical level, but what are we using to measure that implementation in order to be able to hold them to account? And also, she's encouraging that there is a shift from ticking the box to, beliefs and, the integrity and the internalization of those policies thereof. I'm very encouraged by your last point, Linda, where you're talking about empowering men, because uh, one of the participants in the morning raised a concern and said we are focusing a lot on the women or the young girls. What about the young boys? Because those people are the people that we interact with daily. They are going to be our friends. They're going to be our husbands. They're going to be our colleagues. And it brings me to my next question, which is directed to Ubafana. I know you've already touched on this briefly, but I'd like you to just delve deeper into it on how do we highlight the role of boys and men, particularly the role that they play in the process and effort towards gender equality.
Thank you. I'd like to start with the left of this issue of policy. This is a very important conversation. I believe, Linda made reference about the gender summit. By the way, we're planning for another one in November, which is going to cost lots of millions. And now politicians love those people because it makes them feel like they're they can come in and address the crowds and actually get. But what we are confronted with, I believe, is what I call policy misalignment. Earlier colleagues talked about wonderful policy. I think it was Malawi. We have a similar situation in South Africa. We don't run short of policy, but we're running short of implementation. We also have contradictory policy environment. Let me make an example. We have a constitution that has got a Bill of Rights, that is Chapter 9, we talk about equality. We've got values that are in the constitution, right at the beginning of the preamble, that emphasize the need to treat everyone the same. But how many of you are aware that 2 weeks ago, a bill was passed in Parliament, which actually introduces a parallel system for people living in rural areas for justice, called the traditional court. What that means is, if you live in South Africa and you live in Zimbabwe and you are assaulted by your partner, which is very likely happens every day, before you go to a magistrate's court, you must go to a traditional leader.
Oh dear.
So what Linda was saying about the cow, we're gonna see more of those. It actually will even be goats and chickens, because the men will sit there and agree among themselves. Like, no, if you give me a goat, this thing will be fine. What does that do to the justice that is expected of the women? Because the giving of the goat does not take away the fact that somebody was raped. It does not take away the fact that somebody has been assaulted. So this policy dissonance for me is part of the problem, because how do you have in a country where we say the constitution is the primacy of the law, and yet you have another law that actually undermines the rights of all? Because you are introducing another standard now, where rural communities have a different standard as those of us who are privileged to live in urban areas. So these are the issues that I think for me we need to challenge, because we cannot have true equality if we have in the legal framework laws that actually differentiate and actually endorse the level of treating people differently in the name of culture. Well, I'm a culture student myself, but I believe culture must change, culture must adapt, culture must grow. You know, this notion, and I'll tell you why. You know, we've passed that law in South Africa, at least in our case, not because it's an important piece of legislation, not because we wanted to grow culture. It was passed purely for political expedience. Because we are going to 2024, and politicians are going to need votes. So we need traditional leaders who will support us. So we must prop them up by giving them a law that makes them feel important. And let me tell you, colleagues, without fear of contradiction, that law is bad for women and girls, particularly. Because that law says, even if you are raped, you can't go and represent your case in that so-called court. You must get a man, an uncle, father, or brother to go and represent you. So you can't even be there on a matter that affects you directly. So what are we doing? We are actually relegating once more women to be children in a democratic South Africa, where we are saying we believe in the rights of all. So what is the challenge? The challenge is we do need to have voices in this country, citizenship that rises up and says, what is in the good and best interest of all in South Africa? What is it that we need to ensure that we come together and rally around it? It requires me as a man and other men to stand up and say, not in our name. We cannot have laws that continue to relegate women and girls, particularly, into substandard status. Cannot be accepted. It requires men to take that particular decision, because these laws, if you like, they reinforce this privilege of the men. Because I can assure you that this legislation that is being introduced will not affect men. Men will sit under the tree and drink beer together, and the matter will go away. But what happens to women and girls? So I am saying, if we seek to get to that situation where we see gender being transformed fundamentally in South Africa, we require, particularly as men, to stand up and say some of these things that we see in our society are not acceptable. They cannot be done in our way. Let's speak up and speak out loud. It's only through us as men really standing up. Because, colleagues, for the few men who are here, which I thank you for being here, much as we are talking about the African child, these are our children. These are our daughters. These are our partners. in our homes. We cannot countenance a life that continues to subjugate women to subhuman standards. And it requires us as men to stand up and speak and say, no, this is not acceptable. So that we change the fact. Because if you look, who are the people in this building where we are? How many of you know how many CEOs are women in this country? How many women are in boards of the companies that are in this building? Why is that the case even after almost 29 years of democracy? Why is it that even as South Africa tells us that majority of citizens are women, that leadership profile does not change? That cannot be accepted. So to get to that, it's going to require a lot of us men to do, if I can call Marx, if people can still believe in Marx, what Marx referred to as class suicide. We need as men to keep a position that says we will pass the mic in the interest of broader transformation in society, because that is for the good of our society. As we celebrate the girl child today, we need to be able to say it's not about either or, as I was saying to Linda Overland, it's about both and. How do we support the girl child, but at the same time, how do we ensure that this boy that is part of this society is also part of that, so that this support is not seen as an either or, but rather as something that contributes towards the benefit of all in society, for harmony, for growth, and for peace. I think it is possible. It can be done. An alternative world where all of us treat each other with dignity is possible. I'm an eternally optimist. I think it can be achieved. With these young women that I see in front of me who have been making very creative decisions, I can see a bright future. What we need is the young men so that we are all seeing it.
Thank you so much, Bafana. And we have we have a great starting point, for the boys and the men. And Bafana is encouraging that, boys and men arise and challenge differential laws, and that they act out of, public interest and not self-interest, and ask themselves what is good and best for all. Mashudu, I would like you to also um, share on your experiences with having relating with students on a daily basis. In your view, what role do boys and men play in this process? From a young view, of the students, and even spanning across to the work that you've done with correctional services. What would you say is the role that boys and men have to play in this process?
Thank you so much. I think it's also very important, as my colleague also just indicated now, to not only look at the girl child, the boy child, but to look at how do we coexist in harmony? How do we um, how do we challenge, policies and protocols that do not protect the interests of all and the rights of all, especially those that may be vulnerable? But also, how do we also ensure that the responsible bodies, institutes take responsibility? In terms of at a higher institute of learning, how do we ensure that through service provisions that are provided, that boys are also included? The girl child is also included. There's already existing initiatives that are currently being done, but also how do we integrate both? Not only looking, for example, we do have the um, Girls for Girls initiative, promoting again girls that are coming from rural contexts in terms of their psychological adjustment, the physical, the social adjustment into Institute of Higher Learning. But also, how do we educate both genders around the treatment of the other? How do we also have open conversations about what is inappropriate, what is violation, what is discrimination, and also challenging some of the social narratives that maybe have come into play around the role, power dynamics as well. Also, just highlighting to the boy child in terms of what is the role that patriarchal societies that we also find ourselves sometimes positioned in has also given the power, even if it may not feel like it's a transfer of power, but given the boy child a space, but also allowing the boy child to recognize that this could be an opportunity to learn as well, opportunity to know that I can also exist and still be able to establish and achieve great strides. But in achieving those great strides, I don't discard the feelings of others, discard the opportunities of others, irrespective of the gender, irrespective of their unique backgrounds, irrespective of the unique, specific blueprints or personalities, in terms of how do we coexist and, support one another without the fear of that I'm expected to do this role in society, but what about if I go out of the realm of what is expected of me? But also normalizing that it's okay. It's okay to challenge, existing social norms that discriminate others. For the boy child to say that no, not in my name. I don't agree, in practices that may render the girl child, that might render the boy child vulnerable or marginalized.
Thank you for that, Mashudu. Mashudu is encouraging, boys and men to work towards achieving great strides in their respective fields, be it in their academic space, in their social space, or in their corporate space, without discriminatory or disadvantaging practices. And I think that is a great encouragement and place to take off. I'd like to open up to the floor for any questions for our panel. And if there are any questions online as well, please do let me know. Okay, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So I'm only going to take those one round of questions. We're going to have the first 3. I could count him. Okay, we're going to have about 3 questions, and then the panelists can respond, and then we'll have the last 4, and the panelists will respond.
Hi, sorry, I'm gonna keep it quick. So yeah, I just want to open it up actually to the panelists with regards to, are there any government programs that you guys might be aware of that provide psychological counseling to the girl child for free? And if not, then how do you bring that to government to provide that counseling?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Adelia. I would like to ask Ngwase, you spoke about financial products that you speak to the financial sector about developing to assist with the girl child and gender-based violence, I assume. Can you please expand on that? What do you think is lacking in the financial sector in terms of products that could actually assist to reduce the inequalities?
I hope this comes out as a question, not more of a statement. But speaking about collaboration, the government already has the government-wide monitoring and evaluation. You guys spoke a bit about monitoring and evaluation. And how does it become an institutionalized thing to ensure that in terms of collaboration, it just doesn't happen within government institutions. Already it's lacking there, but how do you then make it something that is one? I'm sorry to ask a second question as well, but when it comes to these declarations that governments sign, is it not a problem that maybe that these are not legally binding policies? They call them policies, however, they're not quite actionable in those countries because they're not legally binding at all. It's just a promise. So how do we then trust something that is just a declaration? However, it's stated as a policy, which is something that should be actioned.
So I'll allow the panelists to answer those first three questions. I think the first one was that do government programs provide psychological support or counseling? Are there any existing ones that provide psychological support and counseling for girls? And if not, then how can they be implemented?
Okay, I'll just comment on that question. There are psychological services provided at both Department of Education, Department of Health, and Department of Social Development. But what I can also just indicate also in terms of the scarcity of psychological resources, that they are predominantly often in urban areas. Predominantly, you may not find that they are in your primary level of healthcare, where most rural contexts may have the most closest access to a clinic. So you may find that that service is not available and easily accessible, which is a barrier and gap indeed. To also look at how do we bridge this gap. There are usually professional nurses within a primary level of care. Some of them may be trained in mental health care to screen. However, they'll need to still cascade to secondary or tertiary level of care where they'll have to go to a district hospital. From a district hospital, if there isn't availability of psychological services through a psychologist and also a psychiatrist, then they will go to a tertiary level of care, which is also quite a challenging process, especially that mental health is on a spectrum. This may affect sometimes your insight, it may affect your judgment, it may even affect your ability to recognize and understand instructions, depending on the severity, which is indeed, a significant challenge in terms of access for the girl child. And if they are in a rural village where the closest facility is a clinic and there isn't someone to support them, where do they go? But what is also good is that there's lots of work that has been done by NGOs that support mental health, providing free mental health counseling, such as your study group. They have a free line that you can call at any time. However, that may not always translate to a face-to-face contact with a professional psychologist. So the services are available, but they are limited, especially in scarce resource contexts.
Thank you for that, Mashudu. Nwase, there was
Yeah.
a question for you as well on
Yeah.
financial products.
Yes, thank you very much. When I refer to the issues of financial products and services, basically we were looking at to what extent do the financial service providers also take into account the needs of the underserved. And in this case, I'll talk about the micro enterprises or small enterprises. You find that financial service providers will come up with a product targeting the medium and the big enterprises because they have collateral. So what we've been doing is promoting an environment where financial service providers should also look at other alternatives rather than focusing on collateral. So they come up with a product that will make financial products and services available to the micro and small enterprises without them having to provide collateral. So in this case, we are piloting on what we are calling the movable assets-based lending, so that the financial service providers could actually look at the past, the history of that micro insurance, micro business, or even micro insurance, potential for that small or micro enterprise to be able to access resources. So those are some of the products that we are currently, piloting in terms of making sure that the financial service providers are not just focusing on profit, but they are focusing on coming up with a variety of products that will also bring into the sphere the informal sector. Because you'll find that, like for example, in Zambia, the informal sector is almost as large as 70%. So how do we get the financial service providers, to be moving many of the micro businesses from just being informal into formal? So we are also working to promote incentives. How can financial service providers also come up with incentives which government can also step in, to make sure that they incentivize financial service providers who are really targeting those micro and small enterprises. So I think that's the context that we come in, because we want to make sure that we're leaving no one behind. And the micro and small enterprises can also grow and begin to contribute to the national GDP. They can also contribute to growing employment levels. They can also contribute by getting insurance for themselves, to mitigate the risk of any losses in future. So in that regard, we are also looking at promoting micro insurance, because right now, if you're looking at agriculture or even within the big businesses, it's those big businesses that are able to pick out a financial, package in terms of insurance. So we are promoting micro insurance such that the smallholder livestock farmer in the village can also be accorded an opportunity to get a very micro level kind of insurance product that will allow them to pay in very small amounts over a period of time without them having to feel the pinch of paying for the premium. So those are some of the examples.
Thank you. And the last two questions that actually speak to each other. The participants said that how do we institutionalize these implementations and monitoring of them thereof, and also expressed that of the view that the policies are not actionable because they are not legally binding. I'm not sure between Linda and and Bafana who wants to answer that one.
Well, in terms of the policy, for the international instruments particularly, um, they are binding. What is required is that when the country signs on this international protocol, they then need to move to the next level, which we call domestication. Domestication means you make it part of South African law. And once it's a law, of course, then it should be implemented. Now, the wish and the reality is different. Because as I've said in my earlier intervention, even with our own laws in this country, which are good, many of them, but the implementation is woeful. And that's the problem. And that's where you and I come in. Because you see, government generally do as much as their citizens hold them accountable. If you give politicians a free ride, they will not do anything. But will pay for their rent and their water and their cars and their youth and their clothes. So we need to ask them for much more than them expecting us just to vote once in 5 years. We need to be able to say to politicians, we have voted for you, we have given you power, we have actually borrowed you our power. If we are not using it correctly, then you need to ship out. Part of our challenge at the moment, I was sharing with colleagues over lunch, is that our electoral system, unfortunately, is a problem. Because in this country, we elect for parties, we don't elect for people. And so if you want to recall a politician, it's a massive undertaking. In fact, it will not happen. Because the honchos who sit in their head offices of the political parties, and I'm talking about all of them, in this respect, none of them are immune. They defend their own. And they would rather shift people around. You mess up here, we'll make you an ambassador, as if being an ambassador is, a better option. So what we need in this country, and there's a big conversation going on currently by several civil society groupings, Democracy Works and Rivonia Circle, which are leading in that conversation, and My Vote Count, I think, where the Constitutional Court ruled, I think, over 2 years ago to say, let's transform the electoral law. But of course, those who are benefiting from the system, it's not in their interest. So it's coming to 2 years now, because for them to factor it into the next election, you need 2 years to prepare for the next election. So they've delayed the process. Up to now, we are not sure, because they are not too happy with this electoral system where citizens can either stand in their own right, but also can recall those that don't do the job. What we need in this country, I believe very strongly, is a hybrid system that has constituency and also proportional. Proportional is important for particularly representation of those that are vulnerable. We still live in a society where, for instance, there are people who will not recognize women as leaders. So in that respect, you need proportional representation that will ensure that we have women in parliament, that will ensure that we have young people, that will ensure we have people with disability, and that system is therefore important for that. But I argue very strongly as a person that we need to do away with this party slates. We need to be able to say, I live in Alexander. Many of us, I live in an area called Kempton Park in Birch Acres. I don't know who's my MP. So if things go wrong, who do I hold accountable? Nobody. Now, those things we are asking about, when it comes to those laws, who do we hold accountable? We don't know, because there's no one who's the face of that policy at a country level. We have signed CEDAW, we have signed Maputo Protocol. Let me tell you, we are supposed to report periodically. There are years when we go to this. I mean, if you want to go to New York and see what happens with our politicians, you'll be ashamed. We go every year with huge delegations. But there are years when we don't even submit reports on CEDAW, which is something that we have signed. So I ask myself, why do people go to New York if they're not going to report on the work that they're doing at home? Of course, we all know they go to New York to also do shopping. That's where the accountability mechanism is lacking, because we are allowing people free reign. They go to New York, they get limousines to drive them around, they stay in 5-star hotels, they fly business class and all of that, and spend 2 weeks in the airport city. It's very nice, I love New York. But when I go there for my organization, you can bet your last rent, when I come back, I must report. What was I doing there? I must account. But in government, so if you spend 4 or 5 years without reporting, what are you doing? What's the point of that policy? And that's where, as citizens now, we must be beginning to ask people, you have signed this protocol, you have signed this law, account. What have you done? SDGs, Linda was saying, 2023. Do all of us know here how far are we to meeting the targets that our government has signed? Who cares? Are we getting closer, or are we far, or are we don't know. Now that's the role that we as citizens need to play, and stop giving our politicians a free rein. They are going to be starting to knock at our doors after the end of this year, because they want us to elect them in 2024. What are the questions that we're going to be asking them? We must ask them, you promised in your manifesto to do A, B, C, D. What did you do? If you now want to go in, what are you going to do different, so that we hold them accountable? And I'm saying all of us, because I think unless we begin to do that, we are going to have this conversation over and over. It's not going to take us there. There needs to be accountability.
Thank you for that, Fafana. I think we'll take the last set of questions. I'm cognizant of time, so if you could keep them short, straight to the point, and then the panelists will respond.
Oh, my question is directly to Babu Kumalo. During your years of experience with the Sonke gender justice, I just wanted to know that with the males you've worked with, have you been able to groom, to educate men on how to live with young girls? I'm talking in instances of single fathers. Have you been able to teach them on how to live with a girl child in a household, in terms of the previous conversations we had earlier in the morning about menstruation, puberty, and whatnot? Have you been able to groom men and educate them enough on how to maintain a girl child from their toddler stages to being teenagers and growing?
Well, my question is more or less directed to everybody in the room, is that the panel is more focused on collaboration. But then when Linda, right? When she started, she was like, we call it a celebration. but it's more of a lamentation. It's like we're crying, but we're talking about all these achievements or all these problems and possible solutions for the girl child. My question is, we are here today, right? But where is the girl child? How is that the cooperation if we're able to be in such spaces, but then we don't have the girl child present in such spaces? We don't have the girl child being able to say, yes, I know of this organization, I know of the implementations they've done, I've seen 1, 2, 3, 4 of them doing. Where is that voice for that girl child? It's always more or less like research is done and then it's collected, it's put into a nice book. It looks beautiful in black and white, like the policies and everything. It looks very beautiful. But then where is the actual evidence that we can see? Because personally, I once heard a person say, for you to get tired of something, it needs to happen over and over and over again. And from Linda's perspective is that she's gotten tired of seeing such conferences happen over and over and over again, but we're still crying for a certain change. You know, I'm African, and I've noticed that in every African essay or journal or whatever I've read is that Africa is always, in whatever heading, we always termed with a term or a baptism or a word that has to do with struggling, that has to do with something painful. You know, it's like for Africa to be noticed, we need to talk about pain. You get where I'm going? So with me, it's like if we want to talk about cooperation, collaborating, where then is the collaboration? If the link is the organization and then the child, where in that link are we losing it to a point where we're reaching a point where we're like, why are we always crying? And then my other question is, uh, Mr. Kamalo said, for transformation to happen, it requires all of us for transformation to take place. So what I've noticed is that NGOs, private sectors, and everything else, we always want to point at the government and be like, the government is doing something wrong. The government, and not necessarily realizing that we have adopted what the government does. We have reached a point where now we are treating what we do, activism, as a job, not a passion for change. And which also makes me want to ask again, especially the panel, is that has this reached a point where it feels like a job more than it is a passion for change? And then, okay, this is the last one. Another thing is, okay, I'm from Johannesburg, right? Constitutional Court, Constitutional Hill, the famous prison. There's even Mandela's letters there at exhibitions sometimes. It is a street away from Hillbrow. You can Google Hillbrow. It is a street away from Hillbrow. Now, these palaces, they even have an ever-burning fire there. It's beautiful. It looks so pretty when you're passing there. But then a street away from the change they're supposed to be making. That's how far it is. They come, the big guns, they come with their because, hold the terminus, but they're street away from change. So what I'm trying to get us to understand is that has policy making become a job more than it is a passion for change?
Thank you so much for that. So my name is Dumisile, and I'd just also like to echo the first question that Angel asked, because I feel as young people, there's a lot of pressure on us to say, take up space, take up platforms. There are spaces for you, there are platforms for you, but I don't know if this sounds ignorant or I'm just, not aware. But my question is, where are all of those platforms? I feel that there is awareness that has been done in terms of addressing other issues that we are facing as young people. But as Angel is saying, you can't. I feel it's very ignorant to represent an issue that I'm going through as a young person while you're not exactly in my shoes. You are taking it from hearsay. So my question is, yes, as young people, we are forced to take up space, but what platforms are there and how do we actually access these opportunities to actually go and advocate for ourselves, to say, this is what we want and this is how we want it. We have access to this, we don't have access to this. So in terms of advocacy, That's my main question, that where are these places, where are these platforms, and how can we access them and be the agents of social change?
Was there a question at the front? We have one question and the last one.
Thank you so much. My name is Tawonga Dalikeni from the International Federation of the Red Cross, and this is directed to Linda. Thank you so much for the wonderful work that you're doing with Love Life on emancipating our young people and their parents. You mentioned that there are policies that actually stipulate that you can't marry off a child of a certain age, and also assuming that this is part of the difficult conversations that you have. And now my question is, how are our communities taking this in consideration of our societal and cultural norms, especially in the rural and disadvantaged communities? And also, which other methods do you think can be employed to hammer this message of ending child marriages and teen pregnancies?
Last question from Prof at the back.
Thank you very much. I will make it a comment and brief because I'm aware of the economics of time right now. My name is William Ofu. I work with the Debt Center for Diversity Studies as a researcher. And the subject of women, gender, sexuality, and related issues is a big portfolio in our center. And my work has exposed me to the work of two relevant organizations, that is the Institute for Security Studies. I collaborated with them on GBVF, Gender-Based Violence and Femicide in South Africa, which is a tragedy. And another very relevant organization, the International IDF, I work with them on women political participation in Africa, which is another story that is very rich in tears. I want to challenge the binary, the gender binary. This morning we talked about the boy, the girl. Things are deeper and much wider than that. There are no longer any boys left in boys. There are no longer any girls left in girls. And maybe it's supposed to be like that. The binary itself is troublesome, but maybe the subject is for another day because there are many non-gender conforming young people that go around and being forced into this framework of either being boys or either being girls. But the question that I want to deposit with us, why do women vote men against themselves in Africa, especially?
Why do women?
Because numerically women are a majority. But the paradox that I identified in the research that I was talking about with the international idea is that women do not want to vote other women. Even with all the massive numerical advantage. And Kumalo, it goes back to our education system, our socialization, in that politically it seems like women wish they were men. In that when another woman stands up, it's women who are the first to walk away from that candidate and that young lady that wants political office. So there is homework that needs to be done in socializing women, radicalizing them to see leadership in each other. Because it's such a mathematical issue that you've got the numbers. Why are you allowing politics to be the domain of men forever? And then finally, Kumalo, that issue of politicians pretending to be empowering traditional leaders is a double-edged sword. We can see through the trick that we are being sacrificed on the altar of political expediency by political parties that want power. But what it tells us also from an intellectual and activism standpoint is that we need to go there to the traditional leaders, to the communities where this violence against women is happening, to educate those leaders, to educate those elders, those villagers, so that when they use the power that they've been given by politicians, they used it from a just and informed point of view. So isikhathi sokuthi izinduna sizifundise i-gender empowerment, gender parity, ne-women political participation. Ngiyabonga.
Okay. Okay, we have a couple of questions. So in the interest of time, I'm going to allow some of the panelists to answer more than one question. The first one was to Bafana, and the young lady was asking, have you been able to educate men on how to live with young girls from the stage of toddlers through to teenagehood and beyond?
Yes, the answer is resounding yes. The program I referenced, Men Care, for those of you who have access to technology, just Google on our website and go to our resources. We have what we call Men Care program. Part of the Men Care program, which I was referencing, we teach men that they must be available, support their partners, and be there in the lives of their children. And part of that, of course, is then teaching men life skills around caring for children. So you can check that out. And if you want to follow up, please, my contacts are also available. But I can tell you that it's very positive. Many fathers are actually willing, are longing to have time with their children and play that role. We participate with a regional entity that, for instance, facilitates advocacy for menstrual care, and we bring young men to that space because we argue that this is not just a battle for young women. Young men can support, can walk the journey with young women. The response from young men is positive. And I think once we start there, by changing the mindset of the young men, it then does influence how they also relate to their own children, because they are part of this thing. Secondly, we have a program, two programs actually. One is called Power to Youth, which we run in the region. It's actually a global program, but it's run in several countries, including South Africa, which is targeting specifically young women around issues of sexual reproductive health and rights. It was designed specifically to ensure that those questions are also answered. And in those conversations, we then bring both young girls and young men around these issues. The third one is called Generation G, which is Generation Gender Equality, which we also run in South Africa. Also, that is about how do you build the capacity of young people to be able to speak for themselves, particularly young women, around participation in democratic processes, and answer my friend at the back around issues of representation, participation. If I can link to the question that you asked, if you don't mind, Chairperson, so that I also don't have to come there. The issue of traditional leaders is very important. I agree with you. We must engage. We do. In fact, we have a program at Sonke called Social and Structural Drivers, where we work both with traditional and religious leaders, because in many instances they are gatekeepers and are always resistant to transformation. Our approach is not to throw stones. Our approach is to say, how do we work with these very important and influential structures in society in order to help transform. And that program is also very important. In fact, we've got now several traditional leaders that are very progressive. My colleague referenced a powerful woman from Malawi who is part of the work that we are doing, who has done tremendous work as a traditional leader. And what we have learned for that is that when you do work with traditional leaders, you can actually extend transformation to go beyond, because they take you into spaces that otherwise you would not have access to. When a traditional leader calls an imbizo in a village, everybody comes, and you are able to then ensure that you spread these messages. And what is important, of course, we are always careful. When you go to traditional leaders and say, we want to train you, they resist. They are leaders. Why should they be trained by you? You are just, after all, a commoner. So we also choose our language in terms of how we work with them, because we don't want them to see us as, encroaching, belittling. So our language is intended to say, how do we collaborate? How do we work together to the benefit of your constituency? And many of the traditional leaders have been quite open to that approach. So I agree with you that that is very important. The point you raised about why do women vote for men, I did reference, colleagues, that this thing called patriarchy, don't underestimate it. It's very powerful. Patriarchy has convinced all of us that there's one way of doing things. There's one way of being leader, of showing leadership model, and it has even co-opted women into that. So let's not blame women. Let's look at the system that drives why is it that women do that, so that we transform it. But patriarchy is not a person, so we can't go to patriarchy and say stand aside. We need to work systematically at how do we engender this new thinking even amongst women, so that as we talk about liberating women from patriarchy, how do we also liberate men from the hooks of patriarchy? Only then will we get to a position where really there's nothing like the pull head down syndrome, but rather women are able to support each other and all of that. And I want to say, also it's to the benefit of men that we see those things that, of course, women don't support each other, because if they don't support each other, they support who? Us men. So it requires us to also say no. I always decry the fact that you go to checkers, majority of the workers there are women. But I can tell you now, if you go and look at the shop stewards at checkers, majority are men. They will choose a man even if that man is so hopeless. But because he's a man, they will choose him. So we need a lot of education that says, look, these things you can do by yourself. You just need. But as we do this, then how do I, as a man who's a member of that union, support a leadership that is led by a woman without undermining it, so that you change the narrative about the thinking also from there? Because it doesn't help in our society. Let's tell the truth. If you are a woman, as the deputy minister was saying, you must work 5 or 10 times harder than the men to prove your mettle. When I'm a man, I make a mistake, people say, no, understand, it's just getting into this position. If it's a woman, the first comment is, we told you. These people are useless, they won't do anything. But men will make mistakes all the time. The world is in a mess now because of men, but we will never own up. We have a war in Russia, a war that is driven by toxic masculinity. No one wants to put it like that. We talk about it as if, no, this is just a war. It's actually a war because men want to just show their toys about who is stronger than who and who can throw their toys better than others. And the world is in a mess. So we do need, I think, to call out toxic masculinity. But in that context, also ensure that we educate all of us about this alternative I'm talking about, so that even women think differently. I always decry, I'm talking about the change of the boardroom. Part of the things that I have to deal with in my organization is also women who complain that now women who are in the boardroom are acting like the men. Yes? I think somebody earlier said they also close the door, so that those that have arrived are the only ones who are there. So we need to change that narrative and say, no, let's exemplify a different form of leadership that is inclusive, that is empowering, that is ensuring that we level the playing field, that everybody can. It is possible.
Thank you for that,
Can
Bafana.
I just add something to the issue of women don't support each other and they don't vote for fellow women? I want to give a practical example. I mean, we do, in my previous work experience, we were working a lot with women to promote more women in politics. I had a discussion with a very close cousin of mine, male, who was vying for a position in politics. And what he said is the work of patriarchy. He actually indicated to me to say the men would actually strategize on simply calling names to women that are considered strong in the community. And when they begin to campaign on issues, a man would simply go to the community to say, so and so, being female, has slept with so many men and this is what she's up to. And they bring in all the kind of name calling, such that they take advantage of the gender and social norms, because a community, when they hear that a woman has slept with so many men, they wouldn't even dare to check whether that is true or not. But they will have tarnished your name anyway.
Yeah.
By the time you get back to the community to try and say, but it's your word against what the community has said. And as a result, you find even the issues of cyberbullying, those are done as part of the patriarchy to keep women, especially strong women, out of the picture. So the patriarchy takes advantage of the vulnerability as well as marginalization of women when it comes to issues of power. And that is why we see that. And then secondly, one of the points that have been raised into our electoral commissions is that there is need to undertake an analysis. Every time after elections, what we hear is there was so much turnout percentage, and these are the total number of votes. But do our electoral commissions go down to understand who is voting? How many women voted and where are they coming from? We did a small study in Zambia where we're trying to identify women are more on the voters roll. But guess what? Most of the women on the voters roll were actually in the rural areas. And then the question is, do the women in the rural areas actually turn up to vote when it's time to vote? What other challenges impact on them when it comes to time to vote? Probably, maybe they don't even come out to vote, during the time of voting. So it would be very critical and important that our electoral commission should really get onto the analyzing from a gender perspective. Every time an election is done, how many women voted, where did they come from, or how many men and women, of course, and what was happening. Because we may find that when we say, the voters roll has more women, why don't they vote for better women? Maybe when it comes to actual voting, women don't turn up because there are so many other barriers. You find there are men who tell their wives or their partners that we are going to vote for so and so in this house. If you don't, then it means we are not. So in the same thing I mentioned that as I started to say, in this day and age, we can have 54% of women 15 years to 49-year old in the rural areas believing that their husbands or partners are justified to hit them or beat them, or because they've denied them something or they've burnt the food. So what more when it comes to voting? So the similar kind of taking advantage of the vulnerability of women and the power relation that really come up as a result of this gender dimension, we must never underplay them, because it's important to analyze what is happening.
Thank you. And while you answered that question, I just also wanted to direct one of the questions to you that was asked: has activism reached a point where it feels like a job?
I think, yeah, I like that point. First and foremost, I indicated to say, from my own experience, for me to get to where I am, somebody was able to show their passion. I think it's an issue of how do we instill a sense of belief in what we do? How do we instill that passion to believe in what we are doing? Because at the end of the day, I think they need to make information available, but also to appreciate the benefits and also the implications of not taking action on an issue should really be able to drive us to say, if I am going to speak on this issue, I'm going to speak on it because I want to see change. And if I am going to be part of a community, a part of the young women and girls that are really making things happen, I should be able to get satisfaction and joy in seeing that from my own contribution in a community, I can see a change. Because a success of one woman is a success for all women. So I think for me, it's really what it drives with what we are doing, what drives us whenever we get into that space. I've made sure that in my traversing almost all parts of Zambia, for example, have managed to live and eat and work with, all different types of women, right from the community up to the corridors of power. What more does one really want to experience? Because in living and working with women and being able to see the change from not knowing anything for them to become passionate about activism, for me, that is the kind of change that I would feel very satisfied that I've contributed to that, rather than seeing it as simply just a matter of work. I think those are some of the things that we also need to take into account. Because there are so many platforms. I think there was another question to say, where are those platforms? I want to give some practical examples back home in Zambia, where we've been to several communities and we have extended invitation to young women. We've actually set up a young women network, countrywide, right? At national level, we've gone to the provincial level, and we're now going to the district level, opening up spaces for women to simply come and be and do that which they are passionate about. We use the example of the SADC model law on ending child marriage as an example that we were able to mobilize the young women that were available. So we requested them to simplify the SADC model law on ending child marriage, and they simplified it in the local languages. And we provided space and trained them so they were able to go to the community radios to speak for themselves what is contained in the SADC model law. How else can we build champions on ending child marriage if they don't have an appreciation of what is contained at regional level? How do we ensure that it's domesticated within our own national law by simply allowing the young women to simplify that law and share their own lived experiences? So there are so many others, like under Oxfam in Zambia, they have what they call the global platform. So every month they call in young people to simply come and converge for a day or 5 days, and they'll be looking at different topics where they are discussing and also sharing their own lived experiences. I know that there's a lot more that can happen, especially taking the narrative from the national level to the region and to the global level. Of course, we find that when you talk about New York, as it has been said, you find mostly it's the older people that find themselves in those spaces. We can actually do better by opening up opportunities and getting most of the young women to actually open up doors and get them to engage with the UN, to realize what our heads of governments discuss, to be able to be part of those commitments that our government, make. So that when they get back home at national level, then we can mobilize ourselves to say, we heard you. This is a commitment you made to our country. This is a commitment you made to our young people. And therefore, for us, we believe that for these things to happen, this is what we are going to do. And we continue mobilizing and organizing the young people's energy to ensure that the voices keep being heard. So that's the only way we can build the voice and the agency of our young people to ensure that they are found in the spaces where they need to be and they can speak for themselves.
Thank you for that, for you, Linda, there was a question on how are the communities taking the ending of child marriage, and I'd also just like to add as well to the platforms, particularly in South Africa, that are available for young girls to participate, to advocate, and to have a voice.
The engagement with the communities goes beyond child marriages, but really engaging them on issues that affect young people within that particular community. What we have found is that you tend to get kind of two reactions. There are those that are closed up and not interested, but you'll have started the conversation, which is the important thing. And there are those where they want you to come back and continue the conversations. And I think the important outcome that we always want to achieve in those kind of dialogues is to get the community to take ownership for how they move forward in terms of that. Because government is not going to come and police what's happening in homes, which is where most of the issues start. And in communities, it needs to be that smaller group that is taking over that responsibility. And then I think the other question was, what other methods could be used? I'm assuming you're asking about what other methods could be used to engage within community setups. I talked about the community radio station earlier on as such an underutilized tool that could be so important for disseminating of information in the language that is understood within that particular community, because that's the the modus operandi of most community radio stations is that it will speak the language that's spoken within that community. One of the greatest things that's come out of South Africa, right, in the last couple of months is a movie called What About the Boys? And that's a movie that has got the potential to change all to get into every single home the issues that we have been discussing today. So TV is another important medium that could be used, to be able to get the messaging that we want to get out. So you asked me to talk also about the platforms. I mean, in South Africa, there is the SANAC that has got a youth sector there, and that's where young people should be driving their issues through that youth sector. There's a department of youth that is resident in the presidency, which I think young people who want to have their voices heard outside of the organizations that do work with them and engage with them on a continuous basis could use. Every municipality has got a youth desk. And I think the owners, again, back to the question of each one of us should take it upon ourselves to be an activist, then to go and understand your municipal youth desk. What are they doing? What do you want to see them doing? And so on. And then finally, it's about also, the beauty of the present age is that we're living in a social media age that breaks down the barriers and the boundaries and the gatekeeping that was there maybe 15, 20 years ago. And I have had to limit the time that I spend on Twitter because I was always following the Twitter spaces that young people were creating among themselves in their networks. They'll start a conversation. And before you know it, there's 500 people listening to a conversation that was started by one young person or a couple of young people. So I think those, some of the platforms where the thing is, when you want to transform places, sometimes you have to barge into them. Sometimes you really have to barge into those places. So to your point, Christine, about wanting to be director of this, that, and the other, and you've got to understand that sometimes it's an approach that needs you to grab the door open and force your way in. And then you'll get to a point where you realize, you know what, I don't need to wear a pantsuit to work every day. I'm actually going to wear a dress and I'm still going to own my power in a space without starting to look like a man. And then in closing, I think it's the last time you'll hear my voice, to the conveners of today to say thank you. And I hope that in May, on the 13th of May, we will recognize the unofficial day of the boy child and start having conversations around what we have been saying around the role of boys in creating an environment that's safe, not only for girls or boys, but even non-gender conforming people, because when we start to get that right, then we can say everybody is safe.
Thank you for that, Linda. And I think the last and final question I'd like to direct to Mashudu. I know that Bafana did answer it from a patriarchal perspective, but from a psychological perspective, what would you attribute to the voting patterns of behavior? Why do women vote other women out and rather give their vote to men?
I think there's a number of issues that can come to play psychologically. It is also how women view themselves, their perceptions, how they also may feel when there's another woman in positions of power, and how that is also, internalized by each individual in terms of if another female counterpart is in a position of power, does that make me feel threatened? Does that make me feel intimidated? Does that make me feel not as confident, not as capable? And because there's already an existing notion that men may have a better power dynamic, that it's better to shift it to someone else that will be less threatening than the same counterpart. So it's also looking at all those factors that come into play in terms of understanding the power dynamic, understanding our own internal processes in terms of how do we see ourselves, how do we come across, and how do we feel about others in a space where we may not be in positions of power? How do we also feel about our contribution, despite the existing difficult structures that can make it difficult to express yourself, express maybe your own emotional state, and be able to engage at that level. So there's a multiple factorial factors that come into play psychologically in terms of where are the girl child, where's the boy child, where's the other groups or categories in that regard.
Thank you for that. And just to answer one of the questions, because they should ask everybody in the room. I feel the young people, who have attended feel underrepresented. And she says, where's the voice of the girl child and all of this? I want to guarantee you that if you take time to read the edition of the girl child, African Facts, and it came in your goodie bag today, you will hear the voice of the girl child coming out loudly, because we had writers that went into the streets to interview girls who've run away from home and find out why. What was their drive? We have writers who went as far as interviewing, sex workers, and we had writers who even interviewed people who used to conduct female genital mutilation and who are now against that, and people who have been involved in female genital mutilation and how it influenced their life. So if you take the time to just read through the book that you got today, you will hear a very loud voice of the girl child. But we are going to, take that into account in future in our events, and we are happy that you would like to participate, and also you want to be engaged and involved in events like this. It's very encouraging, and like my colleague has said already, that you just need to barge into those doors and always look for these opportunities. What we do with our events, with our partners, is we utilize social media. For example, we make sure that the link is available and that a contact person like Gail is available. So in times like that, do feel free to reach out to whoever's organizing and say, look, I'd like to be on the panel, I'd like to represent the young people, and it will definitely be considered in the near future. So just in closing of this session, I'd like to thank my esteemed panelists who have made the session very engaging and practical. Like I had said, I have solution experts on this panel, and very honored to have been moderating this panel. And in closing, I just want to quote the Vice President of the United States of America, who shortly after she assumed office said, "When we build a world that works for women, we build a safer, stronger, and more prosperous world for all." But I also want to take into account what Ulebu said in the morning. She said, issues affecting the girl child are intertwined with issues affecting women. So I'd like to say, when we build a world that works for the girl child, we are building a safer, stronger, and more prosperous world for all. Thank you very much. I'd like to, at this stage, invite someone who's going to close us off. Her name is Dr. Janet Yolin. Billion. And she's going to give us our closing remarks.
Thank you. It's tough being a girl in Africa. That phrase appears in Leleti Maluleke's article, The Curse of Sexual Terrorism, on page 59 of issue 63 of Africa in Fact. It's tough being a girl in Africa. This simple sentence belies the complexity of what it really means to be a girl in Africa. The 63rd issue of Africa in Fact is a wealth of statistics and information to this end, a collation that should be compulsory reading. The themes of silence and invisibility loom large throughout that narrative. It's tough being a girl in Africa, suffering in silence, in a culture of silence, and silence around menstruation, the hidden triple burden of work, the unseen and undocumented suffering. And then, threading through the conversation is the awakening. listen to our young African women and girls, better understand what our young women need, a need for enabling environments where women feel safe in speaking out, and calls for community dialogue. Do you hear the call? Good Governance Africa heard the call and brought us together here today, both in person and online, to put our collective and influential minds together around Africa's girl child and the critical struggle for health, education, and agency. I just want to go over a few highlights from today. You'll bear with me, please, and you'll bear with me for using first names. I think after spending a day together, we can be a little informal. We started today with Kim's call to us to identify strategies to successfully turn knowledge into action. Linda Vilakazi asked of us to be open-minded, and Lebogang reflected on the complexity of the oppression of girls and women by introducing the intersectional lens through which the issues must be viewed. Sarah asked us two challenging questions, and these are we carrying other women? And are we contributing to entrenched systemic oppression? This led us straight into a session focusing on education and technology. We heard about amazing projects and work from the panelists, both in South Africa and in Malawi. Dr. Rachel noted that her own journey and that of other girl children in STEM subjects and pathways was a lonely one, without adequate mentors, and role models. Can any of us step up and be a STEM role model? The Ministers of Menstruation and Menopause and esteemed panelists then took us on a journey, sometimes challenging, sometimes humorous, wherein the Deputy Minister asked us if we were scared of change. And Candace asked of us, how are we actively bringing our girls and women to the decision-making table? We unfortunately didn't have enough time to hear much from Beryl, or otherwise known as Africa, about her incredible work in the area of sexuality. Apologies for this, Africa, and thank you for joining us online. The personal anecdotes that were wound into the narrative during this session stopped us in our tracks and, I think, deepened the discourse. We were reminded that interventions cannot be uniform. To this end, I think we desperately need the creativity and imagination of many different people from many different walks of life. How can we engage a cross-disciplinary conversation? The invisibility of women from, and it was a phrase used, from cradle to grave, was a somber theme that threaded throughout the narrative in that session. Christine then led us into a discussion around agency and collaboration. Ngwasi picked up on the theme of intersectionality and commonality and the importance of this in ending the perpetuation of GBV and child marriage as examples. We learned about how financial ignorance leads to vulnerability and marginalization, and how FSD projects in Zambia are mitigating this. Dr. Linda reminded us about the seriousness of the topic at hand today. A lamentation. It's tough being a girl child in Africa. Mashudu reminded us that the mind and body cannot be separated. We talk a lot about GBV. We aren't talking enough about sexuality and reproduction. And we certainly are not talking nearly enough about mental health. How am I putting an end to the stigma? And a very important theme that came out of this last session and questions that were asked afterwards. How can I contribute to taking policy and turning it from a dusty page in a file to a living document? We have learned much during today's sessions. It inspires me to ask, how does what we learn change who we are becoming? How will what you have learned today alter who you will be tomorrow? How has what you have heard today changed how you think about your role as a critically conscious and influential African citizen, and the ways in which your sphere of influence, and it is large, can positively impact Africa's girl child? Have we heard the call to action? Thank you, Kim. I want to tell you just a little bit about Boston City campus, if you'll let me. I won't take long. And I want to tell you it because I'm passionate about education. I said so in my biography. And I do believe that what we do does play some very minor role in what we were talking about today. Boston is a private tertiary institution offering higher education, occupational, and short learning programs in the online mode of delivery. Over 60% of our learners are female, and the majority of our learners are first-time entrants to higher education in their families. In other words, they are the first in their family to go to university. There is nothing quite like graduation day to highlight and to witness quite what this access to education means to these candidates. I get goosebumps. Our provision is technologically enabled, and in recognition of differential access to ICT, we have 47 support centers for those who need to access the infrastructure. And these support centers are not located in Stanton and Belleville. They are located as far afield as Umtata, Richards Bay, Kimberley, and Polokwane. I can include Stanger and a whole bunch of others. Boston also offers Cambridge curricula, multiples of them, at lower and upper secondary levels. Now, my point in mentioning all this was Boston has heard the call, and every challenge needs somebody to go first, and so we'll jump in and let you know how cold the water is. And we will, together with the GGA, who will help publicize this, we will start an initiative to bring free Cambridge curriculum-based education to the girl children of Africa with the support of corporate leadership. So if you're interested and you would like to learn more, stop me after this, or you can always email Gail and she can get hold of us. So many pages, so many pages. Okay. In closing, I just want to quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, and I think today epitomizes this. To know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. This is to have succeeded. Today's event would not have been possible without the generous participation of a number of individuals. Our heartfelt thanks must go to Linda Vilakazi for planting the seed for the production of this issue of Africa in Fact. To our main sponsors, to the Attorney General Alliance, and I think the representatives might still be here, to the Telkom Foundation and Boston City Campus. We have to thank Good Governance Africa, and in particular Susan Russell, the editor of Africa in Fact, and her production team and the marketing team. Too many people to name one by one at this point. We have to thank the person who made today operationally happen, Gail, and I'd like you all to give her a round of applause. Thank you, Gail, for putting it together and for liaising with us so professionally over the last few weeks. We have to thank Lebogang for giving us an opening address, which set the scene for today and was wonderful. And then every single panelist deserves mention, and I think we'll just give them a round of applause as a grouping right now. And then finally, but certainly not least important, a huge thank you to everyone who joined us today in person or online for your participation, sometimes robust, but certainly awe-inspiring and interesting at all times, your participation during the discussions. I thank you, and I wish you a safe journey onwards.
Plato said, "Who will guard the guardians? Who are our guardians? Do they care about us? Are they accountable for their actions, or are they above the law? Who elects these guardians? Us? Them? Someone else? And if they guard us, who will guard them? Who will guard the guardians? The Malin Guardian, if you really want to know.